And now to get started, let me introduce you to today's speaker. Ellen is an award-winning learning experience designer and a strategist with over a decade of experience in L&D. She also is a game designer, podcaster, agile practitioner, and an innovative evangelist. She believes in people and interactions over process and tools, and in harnessing the power of play for learning. And as the lead learning strategist at ELB Learning, Ellen guides how teams members across the company think about learning, organizational psychology, and technology. And so, with that, please welcome Ellen.
Hey, thanks, Liz. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, beautiful.
Okay, fantastic. All right. So I think at this point, I take over the screen share.
Go for it.
All right, here we go. So you're about to get a bunch of orange on your screen. Mention in chat if that is working as intended. Okay, let me get the chat up again. Fantastic. Looks good. Okay. That's great. All right. So it's great to hear, to see everybody in chat this morning. Looks like we have a bunch of people from across the US, maybe some global folks turning in. I see a lot of representation from Florida and Arizona right now. But it's good to see everybody. I'm calling in from Minnesota, where it's not as humid as Florida, but definitely more humid than Arizona. So that's how it is in my neck of the woods right now. As Liz mentioned, I am the VP of Learning Strategy at ELB Learning. And what that means in a nutshell is that I help our customers figure out what problems they're trying to solve and identify the best ways to go about solving them. And that all relates to what we're here to discuss today. We've got critical issues facing L&D professionals, rapid changes due to AI, budget constraints, always a factor, but feeling especially acute right now. And of course, staffing challenges, a direct result of the previous two factors. So I'll be guiding you through a couple of specific tactics, some strategies, and some tactics that you can lean upon to adapt and build a more adaptive learning culture within your organization and across your teams. So we're going to cover today, I think, some of a subtle cause of training fatigue in complex environments. And we're going to be looking at an evidence-based approach to understand why where frequent requests for training are coming from. So when we get requests from other teams in our organizations or from organizations as a whole, where are those requests coming from? What impacts the frequency of those requests? How can we understand the systems in which those requests come to be so we can maybe get ahead of that? And then also as part of the session today, I'm going to share basically a 3-step technique that will help you focus on the most important requests, which can then protect your teams from burnout and change fatigue overall. Some sources that I want to kind of lean in on. I just want to share these resources. These are some that have informed today's session, and they include insights from leaders like Andy Grove, and then also some key concepts from motivational interviewing. So there's some wisdom from therapists that we're going to be leaning on a little bit today, but definitely using it in an L&D context. So these will help frame our strategies for navigating our ever-changing landscape. And if you want more links or you have questions about how to implement some of the things that you see today, then please reach out. My email's on this slide, and it'll also be on the last slide. So when we pause at the end for a longer Q&A break, then you can go ahead and jot that down, and you can feel free to message me afterwards, and we'll help you out. So the first thing I want to share is actually it's a cartoon about marketing, but I think it might be kind of relatable because I think we're often put in similar situations when it comes to how L&D is treated within organizations. We're rarely seen as a driver of organizational results, or at least the results that get reported on, even though we're often involved in really critical activities that directly or sometimes indirectly contribute to those results. So this is all about marketing. Yes, if you're in a crunch, if your organization is struggling and you need to pull the emergency levers, sometimes those emergency levers are simplistic solutions that don't necessarily result in the kind of robust, systematic changes that can influence the complex organizations that we find ourselves in. So, I think Isaac Newton said it, if we have seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's why we're going to be pulling from a few different sources of inspiration for today. We're going to be kind of building on some established wisdom in L&D, We know that we're often the first to get cut. Partially that's because it's difficult to parse the value of L&D activities. But then that lack of investment in L&D leads to under-resourced training teams. It leads to a lack of a learning culture, which can drag on productivity overall in a variety of ways. And it can lead to kind of a triage approach to dealing with any barriers to human performance that the organization might encounter. So I'm curious and I want to see in the chat if, in addition to these three things that I mentioned, we're often the first to get cut. Often it's because we have a difficult time telling our own story and highlighting the value of L&D activities, and then that lack of investment can lead to further problems down the road. As we continue on to kind of the next piece, I want to ask what might be some other factors at play in the constrained dynamics of an L&D team within an organization, or at least ones that you've encountered. So I'm just going to put that into the chat right now, um, so that you guys can kind of pop in some ideas into the chat as we kind of go along. Yeah, I see Mary mentioned in the chat, lack of early knowledge about what is coming. Yes. Yep, low investment into LMS and tools, lack of leadership buy-in. Yep, these are all specific things, I think factors that contribute to that overall difficult dynamic. Yep, not planning time. Good design does take time and it takes involvement from key stakeholders. Difficult to be able to do that. Pivoting to perceived learning emergencies. I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Jeanette, because that's what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to give you some actionable tactics to deal with making that triage a little bit easier. What really is a training emergency? Yep, C-suite doesn't believe in training no matter what results you provide. That's really tough. That definitely sounds like a cultural issue. And those are really difficult to change. Takes a lot of time to do that. Yep. Smooshing us into small windows. I am seeing so many relatable challenges that you're sharing in the chat today. So I'm glad that we're kind of recording this in the chat because I want to maybe come back to some of these things later on in the session and see if some of what we share today might spark some ideas about how to deal with those specific challenges. Again, in a complex environment, there's rarely one change you can make that can solve all the different problems that we're running into. But if we're making incremental improvements over time, we should be seeing, hopefully signals that those issues are improving. So when I talk about complex environments, I want to kind of share, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more. I want to share an idea and a way to kind of visualize that complexity. And this is a specific diagram from Friedrich Rach. I'm probably messing up his name, but it's a publication called System Dynamics in HR, an example of causal loop diagrams used for discussing a human resource. So we all exist as individuals and within teams as part of these larger systems, and those systems always have different inputs and outputs, and those inputs and outputs are changing, and that changes what we need to do in response to that. And so this is changing on a daily basis, an hourly basis, so on and so forth. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to figure out what the right action is to do in any given circumstance. And if you just zoom out further and further, you're seeing more and more complex systems at play. So this author explained it really well, and I'm borrowing his work here. So when you get the slides, the PDF slide printout after the session, you'll see the citation in the bottom of this slide, so you can track down his work and look into it further. But basically, he used these causal loops to show how a human resources department can be full of these interdependent relationships. And we call it a causal loop because it's showing these interdependencies. If you change one thing, it creates and causes different cascading effects throughout the rest of the system. These are also related to feedback loops, right? So causal loop, you start something here and then it can create different effects on parts of the organization, but depending on how the organization is structured, it can feed back into the original cause. And so you can kind of get these feedback loops, just like you're on stage with a microphone and a guitar. If you're not at the right distance, then you can create that kind of auditory feedback loop and drive your audience completely batty. So for those of you who are seeing a smiley face, I like your optimism. I like that you're seeing a smiley face. I am going to do my Rorschach test on myself with this later because I have not been seeing a face. But I'm really curious what kind of shapes everyone else will see. Okay, so an example of a feedback loop might be that's unrelated to HR. An example might be putting money into a savings account. You put money into a savings account, it earns interest, probably a small amount, but that means you now have more money in the account, which earns more interest. At least that's how it's supposed to work, ideally. Small amount of interest, so not always necessarily the case. So I'm just kind of going to leave this up here, and I want you all to kind of look at if we can see the individual nodes into this diagram. Can anyone see a feedback or reinforcing loop in the monkey face diagram that we're seeing here? If it's too small, let me know, and I can point out a little bit more about what we're seeing here. Is anyone seeing any feedback loops here? Too small? Okay. All right, so I'm just going to kind of label some of these. We've got number of employees available to work, number of temporarily assigned to other departments. If employees who are late, let's say that we start down here at the bottom left, employees who are late, if we have more employees who are late, then that creates a negative effect on the number of employees available to work. When that goes down, that impacts productivity, which can increase the number of perceived training requirements, goes back around to having more numbers in training, which then decreases the number of employees available to work, which then decreases productivity, which then increases the perceived training requirements. And this is kind of where we can see that feedback loop. Now, we're going to play around with this a little bit more because yes, this is a bit difficult to see. It's a little too small. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to share a link with you all, and we're going to actually go to an external site called Loopy, which is the best name for our website I think ever created. And you're actually going to be able to play around with this a little bit. So let me grab the link for you all. I'm going to copy this. I'm just going to put it in chat for everyone. It's going to be a very ugly URL. I am sorry, but it should bring you to, yeah, that's the biggest URL I've ever seen. But it should bring you to the Loopy site, which you will see on your screen as something akin to this. All right, is everyone seeing Loopy? Okay, Krista says it's working. That's awesome. If you don't want to click on it on your own, then you can follow along with me on the screen share. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, so what we're seeing here, so I'm just going to keep going through my screen and you guys can play along with it as I'm talking. We're going to take a few minutes to play around with this because I think this is a great tool for visualizing the type of feedback loops I just described. It's a lot easier to see this when you can poke around at buttons and see things happening on the screen than to watch somebody, talk through it. So what we've got is this orange productivity. This is kind of one of the things that we're looking at. We've got employees at work. So this is basically the same kind of chart we were just looking at in the previous diagram. When you click play here, what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to put up and down arrows. So if you want to increase employees at work, what you're going to see then is a cascade of and down, kind of just scatter across the screen. And if you follow those motions, then what you will see is the effects on the rest of the system. So let's go with say maybe a drop in productivity and see what happens there. So as I'm following these inputs around, fewer employees at work leads to less productivity. If I follow from productivity and looking at more overtime used, less time with family, morale goes down. Morale goes down. I follow morale goes down. That means more related arrivals. That means fewer employees at work, less productivity. And so I can follow these arrows around and see just by following the motion where the feedback loops are going to be. Yeah, it's a fantastic tool. And obviously, you can see how you might diagram some other parts of your organization, not just for your own analysis, but it's also a really great way for you to communicate what's happening in your organization to other people who are caught up in the web. Sometimes it's very difficult to see the systems at play around us. But when you can kind of simplify and visualize it like this and let people play with it, it's a great way to build understanding. Oh, I'm so sorry, Teresa, your work has a firewall. Well, I hope you're able to kind of see the cascade of arrows that's happening on my screen right now. Okay, so we talked a little bit, and I'm not able to kind of show the top part of the screen right now, but that's the feedback loop that we talked about in the previous slide, where fewer employees at work means lower productivity, means greater, perception for the need for training, so on and so forth. So I'm curious what other feedback loops we're seeing in this diagram as these dynamics play out. So go ahead and type some things that you're seeing in chat. Are there other feedback loops that are related to employees at work, productivity, training requirements, so on and so forth? What other feedback loops are you seeing in the diagram? Go ahead and answer in chat. Mostly I'm seeing amazing. This is cool. Yeah, overtime used. That's another one. Yeah, okay, so Maria was asking about the arrows. Yes, okay, I just wanna point out, many of you are pointing out time with family and morale. I think that's a really, really key one as well. Just to address Maria's question about the arrows, some are pointed up and down, what those reflect. So those reflect the causal relationship of one node, one circle on the next node. So if we follow employees at work, the arrow points down. That means fewer employees at work have a result in lower productivity. So if we go down, fewer employees at work have lower productivity, then we have lower productivity means more managers doing employee work. So that's why you're seeing these arrows from productivity to managers doing employee work flip. Lower productivity means more managers doing employee work. More managers doing work means lower quality of supervision. Yeah. Okay. Got it. Yep. So less overtime means increased time with family, higher morale, better productivity. So Tim pointed out that with this diagram, we can actually flip the loop. So let's see what happens to the diagram if we say there is going to be more time with family. So we're going to start the causal loop over here, more time with family, and then see what happens. So more time with family, more morale. I'm going to increase the speed a little bit. Yep, more morale means fewer late arrivals, means more employees at work, means more productivity. So you can play with the speed a little bit and you can watch that play out. Okay. So that's a really fun tool. I hope you guys all have a chance to play around with that and do some of your own diagramming. If you want to share, feel free to email me afterwards. If you put together your own diagrams, I'd love to see what you come up with and be able to play around with some of the loops that you're finding in some of your own systems. I have an evil plan to maybe diagram how chores work in my household. If we don't do the dishes, what happens to the feedback loops? I'll let you know how that turns out. I'm not sure it'll have an effect. Okay, I'm gonna stop here and we're gonna pivot back to um, our our presentation here. Okay, so we talked about some of the feedback loops that we saw in that diagram, which was a kind of an illustration of how training requests work in an organization. Um, these reinforcing feedback loops can result in what we saw, endless cycles of these training requests leading to, and that's what leads to change fatigue. Okay, change requests, fewer people who are working, that means more overtime, that means less morale, so on and so forth. And the more that we're seeing gaps in performance from where people are to where we want to be, if we are in a culture where training is kind of seen as the hammer to to every problem's nail, then it's going to result in even more requests. And that's just going to continue the cycle. So if this is a cycle that we're perceiving in our organizations, more training is not necessarily going to break us out of that. So that's why it's crucial to recognize these loops and address them effectively. If we get caught into that mode of just hammering everything that seems like a problem, we're never going to get out of that cycle. So Andy Grove highlights kind of a negatively reinforcing loop that's relevant to our world. If we start with productivity, and then we go around, if we start with less productivity, that means more overtime, time with family. And we kind of saw that playing out in the diagram. So I want to know if as we're kind of going through the next slide or two, who is who else is experiencing something like this in your organization? As organizations grow, your speed decreases while leverage increases. And so you have more people doing more things, but we're doing it more slowly because you need to check with other people and other stakeholders before you're able to act. Not quite with that flat organization. We're dealing with something more complex. Okay, seeing some agreement from Tim and Kyle, this is something that you're experiencing. These businesses and organizations in general become more complex as they grow. Duplication and redundancy increase, and then these decisions are constantly being made on whether we should centralize functions for consistency and greater leverage or keep them decentralized for greater speed. So there's this tension between consistency and speed. Yes, okay, I'm seeing a ton of people say agree with it. This is something that they're encountering in the organizations you work for. It's absolutely something that we're encountering all the time, and I think ideally, it's something that you should constantly be kind of looking at. You should always be looking at the signals. Are we achieving the quality that we want? Are we achieving the speed that we want? If we're familiar with the iron triangle from project management, that's one of the key dynamics and trade-offs that we always have to navigate when we're trying to get a project done. But even if we're not in a project-based setting, it's still a dynamic that we need to think about. Okay, so we've explored complexity through these diagrams. We have this cool little interactive simulation that we can play with, and we can build our own if we want to. We've seen how causal loops act kind of as a midpoint between these different camps, right? We can, in our different teams, get caught in these loops without necessarily even being explicitly aware of them. They're more complex than a straight line, but we can still track dependencies if we have the right tools. So, if we have this kind of chaotic situation, the question becomes, okay, how do we lead people out of it? If we find out that we're trapped in these causal loops, and we're in a spiral, how do we arrest that spiral? How do we arrest the motion and find a way to lead people out of those loops? So, this is from Strategy as a Wicked Problem from HBR. Um, these reinforcing feedback loops, like I mentioned, can put us into a spiral, kind of that endless cycle. When we can recognize those loops, we can address them effectively. And one way we can recognize these loops, is to scan the environment for weak signals instead of periodic analyses. So to get good data, it can take a lot of effort. This is something that my team is struggling with right now, is trying to get good data on how we are able to support the organization as a whole. And we're kind of dealing with some of the same things that Alex is talking about in the chat right now. There's some organizational growth pain trying to standardize processes so that we can deliver consistent quality, but also need to continue delivering what our product is as an internal team, at speed and at scale. And that is a tough dynamic. So what we need to do is we want to have data to help indicate how we're doing as a team. But the data is hard to track down. And so we end up in this situation where we're only getting data maybe once a month or once a quarter because it takes so much effort to get that data. And that's just far too slow. It doesn't enable us to see those dynamics kind of live. This is kind of like predicting the weather, right? If you think about the different models that meteorologists are using to tell us what the forecast is going to be, 2 days from now, 12 hours from now, a week from now. Obviously, we know that their models are more accurate the closer you get to the current time, but they're not necessarily just running those models once per week, right? They are constantly looking at data that's updated. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to scan those models, scan the information they have for weak signals, and then read what those weak signals are going to be. When I say weak signals, it's the whole idea of the butterfly effect. One little cause over here might have a cascading effect on the overall system, which can result in this large impact. But you might not necessarily catch that small change if you're only running quarterly reports. And so that's the wisdom that we're sharing here on screen right now. To be a leader, you want to be constantly scanning your environment for those weak signals rather than conducting just those irregular periodic analyses of the business landscape. One of the reasons that an agile development group or team might have a daily stand up is so that they can broadcast those signals, and they can do it regularly and frequently so that leaders within the organization to whom they are accountable can help them navigate these situations while they're small before they can cause these big cascading effects. So my suggestion here is that let's think about ourselves more as these meteorologists, right? Let's try to create similar systems and models in our organizations that help us scan the environment in the business instead of doing those periodic reviews. And that is what the rest of this session is going to be about, how to set up some of those systems. Okay, I'm going to pause here, see if are there any questions that came up in the Q&A. If you have any more questions that you'd like to ask at this point, pop them in the chat. If we don't get to them now, we'll definitely get to them later on in the session before the end of the hour. Okay. All right. Seeing some notes here in the chat. Alex, I mentioned his comment earlier, or their comment earlier. We're going through organizational growth, trying to standardize processes, make training resources to get people on the same page. I'm curious if anyone else is going through something similar to what Alex is experiencing. Tracy recently federated from a centralized structure. That's been fun. Oh yeah, that sounds, we've kind of gone through the reverse of that. And it's a big change for people, huge change for people. Michelle mentions, yes, probably going through something similar to what Alex is going through. Okay. Liz, any more questions coming in from the Q&A panel?
Yeah, we did have one that I think a lot of people can relate to, so we can take that question here is how can motivational interviewing be integrated in L&D practices to enhance motivation and change? I know we're talking a lot about change.
Yes. Yes. So motivational interviewing is actually something that we're going to talk about directly next. And this is a technique that we're going to be bringing in from psychological study and from therapy. And we're going to apply it at scale to help L&D, to help us make sense of the business environment. So like I just mentioned, if we want to position ourselves more as meteorologists, then we need really good environmental models to help us understand what's happening in the world around us. And what we're going to do in the next 20 minutes or so is we're going to look at how to create something like that.
Very
Awesome. Good question.
exciting.
I see one question coming in from Iona, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. The question is, with your quarterly data, what are you looking at? How are you tracking L&D success? Now, this is really interesting because I feel like everyone's team might be a little bit different. For my particular team that I work with, I'm working with a group of strategists. We're supporting customers and we're supporting other consultants and groups within our organization as thought leaders. So for us, we're all about speed and we're also about quality. It's not new. Pretty much everyone's about speed and quality, right? But what that actually looks like is going to be very dependent upon your organization. We're looking at things like how fast can we turn around a request? What's the accuracy on the amount of scope that we're estimating? So if we're helping a person estimate how much a particular project is going to cost, we compare that to what the resulting project margin was. Did we end up having to do a change of scope? How accurate was our estimate based on what the project ended up delivering? And that's a pretty long feedback cycle. So we also try to layer in some things that help us get to performance incrementally. You know, if we are asking in the midpoint of a project how the customer is feeling about it, that's a good way to kind of shorten that feedback cycle. I'm curious with what other folks in the audience are tracking. So I'm just going to paste that Q&A, that question here, to see if anyone else has additional things that they'd like to share in terms of what you're looking at in your quarterly data or monthly data. How are you tracking the success of your L&D teams? Okay, so we can come back to that and some of your other pain points that you mentioned earlier in the chat in a bit. I do want to continue on because I want to get to that motivational interviewing question. So I want to start by exploring the language of motivation, because if we are talking about being able to set up systems that help us understand the organization at scale, one of the things we can lean on is the way that people are communicating in the organization. And a lot of that is through text, and we're communicating through language. So I think I just want to ask you if some of these requests and the way that they're phrased sounds familiar. I need to make a 3-minute training that covers the entire product suite or the entire history of XYZ. I'm hoping to get something for my product launching next week or tomorrow. Maybe I'd love to turn this document into a game, so on and so forth. I'm aiming to create conflict resolution training. So I'm all right. So I'm seeing some things. Marilyn is saying yes. These phrases sound familiar. The way that you're getting requests might mirror the language that you're seeing here. Um, these phrases like "I need to" or "I'd love to" are often a signal of a stakeholder's preparatory state rather than their actual mobilization. And so they're talking about how they as an individual are feeling, not necessarily how they as an individual are acting or how they have prepared their team and the people around them to act. So this is the first step in creating an actionable way for us to scan for weak signals across our organization. We need to look for these types of phrases. I need to, I'm hoping to, I'd love to, I'm aiming to. And we need to maybe think about deprioritizing those compared to other phrasing that might indicate a stronger state of preparation. So these statements lack commitment, right? I need to, I'm hoping to, I'd love to, I'm aiming to. They're kind of passive. I'd like to do this. I'd like to go on vacation is different than I have booked flights for a vacation, or I have scheduled time off for a vacation, or I have found a place for us to stay on a vacation. Um, these phrases signal a desire, but not necessarily a commitment to act or even the beginning of an action that's needed to drive change. So instead of looking at, if we're looking at requests coming in for training support, we're getting a lot of them that are coming in with that kind of non-committal phrasing. And the way that we can kind of think about splitting this is through this darn cat framework. And this is what comes from motivational interviewing. So darn cat doesn't actually have anything to do with cats. And I'm very sorry for that. I'm sorry for misleading you because I feel like when we have an online meeting and we mention cats, we should probably have a cat. I am a dog person. Sorry. Um, DARN is an acronym that stands for desire, ability, reasons, and need. These are the desire, the ability, reasons, and need statements reflect preparatory language, while CAT, commitment, action, and taking steps indicate mobilization. The differentiation helps us prioritize which training requests are more ready to start, more ready for action, and will likely have more support as we go through and actually create the material or the learning experiences for that requester's audience. So, DARN components focus on preparatory change talk. They indicate your customer's willingness to change, while CAT components represent mobilizing change talk, which means that they're actually action oriented. They are creating plans for change. They are taking steps toward that change. And this framework is instrumental in helping therapists elicit and reinforce a client's self efficacy. Sometimes we're the organization's therapists, and we need to do the same thing. We want to reinforce our internal or external customers' self efficacy and motivation throughout our project process. So, as we're scanning the language for training requests, we might use the tools available to us to get some of this language and then parse it. So, I'm going to share kind of step by step what we're doing here. What we've put together here, and I'm just going to demonstrate one way that you could do this, is we have an incoming form, right? So, what we've done here, let's imagine that we have a triage form. We have and I put together this demo triage form. I'll link to it in the chat in a moment, but it's basically a very easy to use kind of two field form where we're asking people to input a request for training. This is where we start, right? So, what's your name? What kind of things do you need? What we might be seeing in some of these is we might be seeing different types of language, right? We need to update our annual compliance training pretty soon. I want your team's help to make it more engaging. We need to roll out the updated compliance training immediately. I've already drafted a timeline to integrate the new legal changes, and we can start the updates next Monday. These are really different requests, right? Not only is one more in depth, which might signal because there's more information that they're more prepared to start, but the language that they're using is different. I've already drafted a timeline to integrate the new changes. We'll be ready to start the updates next Monday. I'm going to review the content by Friday so that we're ready for deployment by next month. I've already spoken with your manager, right? So on the left, we have an example of that darn language. And on the right, we have the example of the cat language. Thanks, Liz. Liz shared the example Google form in the chat. This is just an example. Please don't share any of your private customer information. It's just there so you can kind of see how it types out and just what it looks like. What we can do with this information then is we can actually send it to ChatGPT and we can give ChatGPT some instructions to understand the inputs with a particular type of model. So we can give each of the types of language a type of score. We can quantify it. So instead of just reviewing these different requests kind of one at a time and using our own kind of internal, um, perhaps inconsistent human framework to parse what we're seeing, we can first filter it through something that's a little bit more objective. And we can ask ChatGPT to evaluate the language of these incoming training requests using that darn cat framework. So let's take a look. If we compare, what we can do is we can give each of the inputs a score based on the specific framework. And then we can compare in a spreadsheet all the different requests that have come in the last week or so and what their composite scores might be. And by using that kind of that workflow, Google form or some input form, parsing it through a trained GPT or some other large language model, and then having that output in Excel, we can sort and compare different training requests based on that language, based on which ones are actually the most ready to start and which ones need a little bit more discovery, or a little bit more digging before we really understand where, whether they're ready to start and how important they actually are to the organization. So what this can then be done, what we can then do here is we can take a look and we can actually then respond to these requests in a way that summarizes what we're hearing. So let's say we get multiple requests from one part of the business. What we might do is we might kind of pull that in and we might say, okay, here's what we're hearing and here's how we understand your priorities. And then you can use that to bring stakeholders in, bring leaders in and engage a larger part of the department more strategically rather than just kind of dealing with the flood of requests as they come in one by one. You can say, okay, these are all coming in from these related parts of the business. Maybe I can meet with these folks and we can have a more strategic discussion about what they're trying to accomplish as a unit. And then that can help reduce the flood of requests and help you kind of grab the reins, as it were, and hold on to the steering wheel, instead of just kind of letting the road guide you where it is. This is just a way for you to deal with those incoming requests, give you a little bit more ownership, give you a little bit more understanding and control, and become more of that meteorologist, right? So this is a system where we are creating our meteorological model, as it were. It's a way to deal with the flood, parse it a little bit more, and give us the information we need to take control of the conversation and be more proactive in how we guide things rather than reactive. So on the slide here, again, if you were grabbing the slide printouts at the end of the session today, you'll be able to play around with that form. Liz put the form in the chat, and also there's a QR code here. Okay, so I'm seeing some feedback in here. Kyle's got some claps. Linda's mentioning this is a great idea and something you've been trying to implement even just on your own department's level. Yes, absolutely, and same. Um, there's always more that we can do to improve. Um, and sometimes improving, requires putting together a little bit of a system. But the nice thing about this is that it's not particularly complex. You have to attach some different things, but setting up the individual components here is not very difficult. If you opened up the form, you saw it's just 2 questions. It's very open-ended. People can write in whatever they think they need to write in the request form, and then you get some of that information back. I do want to say, if you need help or advice with structuring your large language model to work with forms or with Excel, I'll share my email at the end of the session and I can get you the advice that you need. Either myself or one of our internal AI experts can help you with that. It's only will take a little bit, but sometimes it just takes a little bit of help, and we're happy to be that brain buddy for you. Okay, so just to kind of recap, we wanted to talk about some ways that we can protect our teams. What we started with was being able to identify reinforcement loops, right? So we talked about what those reinforcement loops are. We talked about how those systems can create this kind of spiraling effect where you get caught into a feedback loop and it's difficult to get out of that feedback loop, even if it's tanking your team's morale. So one strategy we have, one tactic we have is using some tools to visualize those feedback loops and share that visualization with other parts of the organization, have the conversations about what's happening, and then start to build some ideas about how to get out of that feedback loop. A second tactic here is quantify your qualifiers. So we can maybe take a look at that language that we're getting from our requests? Are you getting the darn language where it's talking about someone's emotional state and readiness to change? Or are you seeing the cat language where they've moved on past the emotional state and they're actually taking steps to change and they're enlisting your help in furthering that action? If they're in the cat stage of motivation, then they're probably in a place they're more ready to start than people who are in the darn language, and that mindset. That might help you indicate to the rest of your team where you want to spend your effort. And so that's quantifying your qualifiers. Assign some scores, work with that, and then that helps you quantify those qualifiers, make sense of that language at scale without necessarily having to go through and assign different things manually. You can do this at scale. And that third piece, the way that you can do that at scale is by leveraging technology where appropriate. So you can use technology to assist in number two, quantifying your qualifiers. And then you can also leverage technology where appropriate. You could even build in some automatic responses so you can start the dialogue without ever actually necessarily pressing a button or having to uh, lay fingers to keyboard for each request. So these are different ways, again, kind of 3 steps to create some tactics that help you deal with the flood of incoming training requests and deal with a little bit of that change fatigue that I'm sure everyone is addressing and dealing with right now. Okay, so let's pause here. Curious what other questions have come up. I'm also curious if, as we've gone through today's session, if you have thought about how you might start with one of these tactics, right? If you're thinking about um, the negative reinforcement loops that you might be experiencing. Where do you want to start diagramming them? Who do you want to share those diagrams with? If you're talking about quantifying your qualifiers, do you already have some forms where you could link them into something that helps to quantify them at scale? And are there places in your existing workflow where you might be able to leverage additional technology, such as what we showed today, um, to be able to do that a little bit more effectively and with a little bit more of a streamlined approach? Curious about your questions, curious about any inspiration and plans that you already have to put some of these ideas in place. Liz?
Beautiful. And with that, I think a lot of us, we've shared about chaotic environments. And so I think that's like the first way I want to go into it. So we had a question, what do you do about chaotic environments? No order at all.
Yeah, that is, I think, a really difficult, that's a really difficult one. Uh, I think that with a chaotic environment, I think that one thing you can do is just start at one point and see where it goes. Um, I think diagramming is a super beneficial way of understanding what the parts of the system are that are in your immediate proximity within the organization, right? And that might be as far as you want to go because I mean, everything connects to everything else, right? You can make a diagram as big as the world, as big as the universe. It wouldn't necessarily be worth your time. So think about, how much effort you actually can realistically invest, what parts of the organization you realistically can impact, and then just start with that small thing and try to build a greater and more in-depth understanding of the systems and dynamics at play with just that small slice. The other thing I'd say is that psychological safety is really important here. And I think that's a really difficult thing because in a chaotic environment that we're trying to impact, oftentimes there is not psychological safety. And so I think before you try to impact any change with that, you want to start practicing establishing forums where people can be psychologically safe. And those can be ones that are very restricted. You can say, okay, here's how we're going to approach this series of 1 hour meetings. It's going to be very structured, and that structure is in place so that everyone can feel safe in engaging. And we need everyone to feel safe in how they engage because that's the only way we can actually get authentic information. So I think those two things, right? Start small in trying to build your understanding of the dynamics at play, and then also start very deliberately in how you are getting input. It's fine to put strict rules around how people should engage in a given session, because if you're explaining why those rules are in place and you enforce them fairly within that space, that will help open up that psychological safety and help you uncover the truths about what's going on.
That was lovely said. And I think so many people can align and agree with that in the audience. So that was perfect. I think even taking it a step forward, now let's, we got the chaos calm. How do we build the curriculum? So like what do you do if you're building the curriculum and that has simple, complicated, and complex components? How do we manage that?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think whenever we're building a curriculum, we do need to make sure that we understand how that curriculum impacts the organization's performance. That's not kind of a new idea in L&D. We trumpet that all the time in our industry. Actually doing it is pretty difficult, as we all know. Um, One of the most important, I mean, the first thing to do is when you have a curriculum, which really you can think of as kind of maybe a collection of requests. What is the most important part of that? What are the pieces of the curriculum that have the most impact on the performance of the organization? And figure out what type of impact that you're trying to have in putting this together. I think that, you're never going to have as much budget as you want. You're never going to have as much timeline as you want. So be realistic in your constraints and use that idea of the 80-20 rule, right? So 80% of the results are going to come from 20% of the effort. Look at your curriculum. What are the 20% most impactful things that you can touch with this curriculum? And start with that and then cascade your approach there. So I think one of the things that I always try to coach instructional designers on is not everything has to be training, right? Um, some things can be performance support. Training itself can take different forms. If you have something that's a complex skill and you want to make sure that people have lots of time to practice it, that might be an instance where you want to use multiple modalities. Maybe you want to start people off with a robust simulation and then give them some time in an instructor-led setting so that they can feel a little bit more comfortable with it, and before they actually have to implement it on the job. But some other parts of that are maybe not necessarily things that come up very often, or they're not instances that have a huge detrimental impact to the organization when they do come up. Those could be job aids, those could be videos, those can be reference materials. As long as people understand how to use those reference systems, then they'll be set up for success. So I think you need to identify what's the most important thing you can do, and then make sure anything that's simple or doesn't happen very often and isn't impactful has pretty good standard operating procedures, and are those operating procedures are there in a place that is easy for people to reference. That'd be my recommendation there.
Perfect. No, and I think that's super helpful context and like great examples. And so I think this one next question kind of like even segues into that. Everyone in the chat loves the loop and the loop diagram. And I definitely want, if you make the chore one, to send it my way because I would love that. But even more so, could you provide some more real world examples of using system dynamics or casual loop diagrams in L&D?
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm curious if anyone else could add some of these things on their own, because I'm sure everyone's been kind of thinking about this in their organization. I think that one other one might be culture. I think if we talk about, like we talked about psychological safety a moment ago, if you have a completely chaotic environment with no order at all, I think oftentimes it feels that way. There's usually some sort of order. It's just difficult to crack. Um, but I think that there is a causal loop system involved with psychological safety, um, time, and learning culture. Because I think that if you reduce time, people don't necessarily spend enough of their energy being present with one another, which reduces psychological safety, which then also reduces the organization and people's ability to deal with mistakes, their own mistakes, and the mistakes of others, or the oversights. We're human, we make mistakes, we make oversights, and if there's enough flex in the system, if people have enough time, then those mistakes don't always necessarily result in catastrophic issues. They don't necessarily always result in a scramble. It's just there's enough flex built into the system that it can absorb those mistakes. if we don't have enough flex, if everyone is really tightly, their schedules are too packed, they don't have the time to give psychological attention and space to the people that they're working with, which reduces psychological safety, which reduces the learning culture, which results in more mistakes, which reduces psychological safety, which results in less of a learning culture and more mistakes. And you can see that kind of feedback loop at play. And then people leave because they don't want to work in that kind of environment. And then you have even more mistakes because you have to hire new people to replace them and they're not familiar with your context. So I think you can see these kinds of systems at play in a lot of different contexts, but also you can see them at different levels of zoom in your organization. So you can zoom out and see something that's very large scale, like the feedback loop I just described, or you could try zooming in a very detailed way and talk about how there might be a feedback loop in your very own day. You start with a meeting, you didn't have a chance to get caught up with your email, and then you're behind the whole day, and then you're not prepped for your next meeting. And so you can play with different levels of zoom in the way that you think about your organization and the human performance within it, um, and find all sorts of feedback loops everywhere.
Perfect. Yeah, I know. I'm personally inspired. I'm in marketing, not specifically L&D. So now I feel like I'm inspired to like make that when doing reporting. So I hope you guys are also feeling inspired as well. We had another. Ooh, I see we have a comment. I don't think it's necessarily a question, but
Yeah, Alex shared a really cool idea.
that is a really cool.
Yeah, so yeah, let's call it out here. So Alex said, I'm going to make one for new hire onboarding outcomes to help people understand the importance of good communication and engagement in the new hire training program. Absolutely. Right. I mean, I can imagine it right now. Good communication and engagement means your new hires are more effective, meaning they're more likely to be motivated and stay at the job longer, meaning you don't have to hire as many people, which continues the positive performance loop, right? If you don't have good communication and engagement during onboarding, then people aren't set up for success. People are going to be frustrated with them when they get on the job. It's going to result in more training and potentially more attrition, and then you have to do it all over again. So I can absolutely see how that would be really effective. Um, so I hope that you are able to put that loopy together, Alex, and you give your stakeholders some time to play around with it. Oh, I love this. Yeah, Carissa said, adding to that, the importance of manager buy-in during new hire onboarding. I love how you can just add different nodes to these systems and it really kind of um, changes again the kind of the level of zoom that you're looking at. Um, Very, very cool. I really like these ideas that people are putting in the chat. I really hope I haven't tanked. Speaking of productivity, I feel like I might have accidentally tanked everyone's productivity for the rest of the day. I can kind of imagine everyone being like, clear my afternoon. I'm playing with Loopy. Um, so sorry, not sorry, I guess. Hopefully it results in, greater productivity in the long run.
I always say it's what's it called? Productive procrastination is what I like to call it. So, you're being productive, but you're also procrastinating just a tad. I do see
Yeah.
Terry. That is a larger paragraph, so I don't fully want to read it all, but in a sense but there's a lot of context. So I don't know if you see in the chat, Ellen, if it would be easier for you to read it. But essentially, do you have advice on how to influence behavior changes and gain buy-in for this new model within the centralized L&D and within our learning adjacent teams across the business?
Yes. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So again, so Terry was saying centralized to a federated L&D model. And so what I assume that means is that if we have a federated L&D model, we have multiple divisions or departments that each have their own kind of group of training or L&D folks that are focused on the L&D needs of that organization or that part of the organization. Something that's more centralized is there's maybe one central kind of university function. Sometimes you'll see organizations call this a university, or there will be one central L&D structure that maybe then quote unquote contracts out their people to different parts of the organization, but it's managed centrally. Um, do I have advice on how to influence behavior changes and gain buy-in for this new model? I think communicating the change and why the change is taking place over and over and over and over again is part of that. But I also think that when you're doing that, I mean, that's just change management, right? You got to tell people that the change is coming. You got to tell people that the change is coming. You got to tell them that the change is happening. And you got to do that multiple times. And you have to tell them that the change is here and it's happening now. But then also, when you're guiding people in how to engage with that change, especially something so drastic as this, right? Like they might have been used to working with somebody, and now you're completely turning something on their, they're no longer working with that individual. They're working with a group, and it might feel less personal. It might feel more disconnected. People might feel like they aren't able to get what they want, or that they're worried they won't be able to get what they want. I think one key thing that you can layer into that kind of interaction that people will really appreciate is how to give your team the centralized L&D structure, how to give that group feedback on how it's going, and how to expect follow up from that feedback. So make it easy for people to say, "Hey, tell us about your concerns," or tell what was your last interaction with the centralized L&D team? How did it go? We talked about net promoter score in the chat earlier on. Just, asking a question like that, something simple. How, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend the centralized L&D team to one of your colleagues? You know, just creating some simple systems that welcome people to give their input and their feedback in the new model is a good way to start that buy-in process. Just asking somebody their opinion and then making sure that they feel heard goes a long way in starting that positive feedback cycle. We looked at a lot of negative feedback cycles today, but it's also possible to do a positive one, right? You just get that momentum going, make it easy to start, and you'll start seeing the cascading effects in that positive feedback loop. So hopefully that's helpful.
Beautiful. We might have time for two more questions, but I know we went ahead and started talking about, okay, we made changes, but I kind of want to take a step back with this next question. So, in your experience, what are common signs that indicate tech or change fatigue among L&D professionals? So, what are those signs like?
Oh gosh. Everyone get out a mirror. um yeah, I think if we haven't taken vacation time in a while, that might be one indication. But I think lack of curiosity amongst L&D professionals is probably the biggest sign of that kind of fatigue. Um, because I think everyone who ends up in L&D, however you came to it, there are lots of different pathways into an L&D role. But pretty much everyone who ends up there is there because they are naturally very curious people. Um, you're in a role where you have to not only learn how to do your own job better, but you're also learning the details about many other people's jobs. And depending on what role you're in as a professional, that might involve like roles from wildly different industries, like the energy sector versus quick service restaurants. And I think that if we're in a good headspace as L&D professionals, that's an exciting thing for us. It's exciting to learn new things. And it can be exciting to learn about different technology. Even if it's not technology that we can immediately see an application for, it still feels good to learn about it. If we're in a mindset, if we're in a headspace, if our teammates are in a headspace where it's like, well, here we go again, that's a warning sign. Because I don't think that's where we want to be emotionally. And if we are in that space emotionally, then it's really difficult to engage in the conversations we need to as consultants, whether we're internal or external consultants. It's difficult to engage in the type of discovery conversations and analysis that we need to engage in if we aren't coming at it with that kind of beginner's mind, that curiosity. And if we're not in a positive headspace, if we're really tired cognitively, then we're not going to be able to do that. So watch out for those kinds of red flags. I feel like there's probably an entire different set of vocabulary that we can be looking out for when it comes to change fatigue. That'll have to be on the next webinar. Um, but yeah, that's what I would watch out for.
Yes, next topic for sure. And even some of the chat comments of just like relatability. I think we all, to your point, pulled out the mirror and we've all been there at some point in time in our careers with frustration of change and all of that. But with that being said, we are at time. So is there anything else you would like to leave with for our audience today before we say our goodbyes?
Not really. I did my email's up on screen. If you want to share your Loopy diagrams with me, I'd love to see them. And again, if you have any questions about how to put some of this together from a technical perspective, happy to weigh in and give you some guidance. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you for all of you who participated in the chat.
Yes. No, it was such a good presentation and loved the chat engagement. Thank you for everybody who is still on with us for that Q&A. So with that, we do have some up and coming training industry webinars this month, as well as leading up to our next month. October is right around the corner. It's crazy. You can register for these programs and watch past webinars now at trainingindustry.com. And all of our webinars are pre-qualified for a credit hour by HRCI, SHRM, ISPI, and CPTM. If you're like, what is CPTM? It is the Certified Professional and Training Management Program that assists you in developing core competencies that will empower you to manage the future training needs of your organization. So you can find more information at trainingindustry.com/training. Additionally, September 25th and 26th is right around the corner for our Training Industry Strategy Summit. You can register now for just $99. And you can learn more at trainingindustry.com/strategy summit. Lastly, that evaluation survey should have popped open in another tab in your browser, and we would appreciate hearing your feedback from today's session. Thank you again to our speaker, Ellen, and our sponsor, ELB Learning. And thank you all for your time and attention today. I hope to see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.